Get ready to take a flamethrower to the official narrative and learn what the elites don't want you to know. You're listening to The Tom Woods Show.
Hello, everybody. Tom Woods here. It's episode 2628 of The Tom Woods Show. And I couldn't be happier to have former US Congressman John, or better known as Jimmy Duncan, here with me from Tennessee. He served in the U.S. Congress from, if I remember this right, 1988 all the way through 2019 when he retired. And he's had rather an interesting career because, of course, he served during, let's say, interesting times. And I thought we would bring him back on and have a little chit-chat about a whole bunch of things. So, Congressman, welcome back.
Well, Tom, it's an honor for me to be on your program. I told you once that I think I may be your biggest fan, and I listen to your program probably at some point almost every day. And I really have a lot of admiration and respect for you. Gosh, I read your book, Meltdown, years ago, and you warned us at that time about what was going to happen in the recession of 2009 and 10, and in that period of time. And you were out in front on the COVID fraud too. So I have a great admiration for your messages that you've had, and I think, I think you must have an audience in the millions.
Well, that would certainly be nice. Perhaps the world would be a better place. That's very kind of you to say. I do want to point out that one of the distinguishing features of your career, which we've talked about in the past, but I want to make sure everybody's aware of, is that you were the last Republican opponent of the Iraq War to retire from Congress. So you had a vote that was controversial at the time, but as you've said before, as time went on, that vote became one of your more popular votes. So that's an interesting thing. I want to talk about, I have a bunch of thoughts here. Your father, well, first of all, I got the idea of bringing you back on because I saw you at Ron Paul's house a couple of weeks ago. Right. And we got to chatting, and I thought, doggone it, why am I not having Congressman Duncan back on? So I want to start with, your father also served in the U.S. Congress and represented the same district you did?
Well, basically, people are fleeing the Democrat-run states and cities so much that people are flooding into East Tennessee. We have no state income tax and a lot of other good things that people are finding very attractive. They're leaving these high crime, high tax states and cities, as you know. And so the district has had to shrink geographically quite a bit. It's primarily Knoxville and the suburbs of Knoxville. So, but it was a great privilege and honor for me to serve. And my dad came from a subsistence farm. My grandparents had 10 kids in an outhouse and not much more. My dad hitchhiked into Knoxville with $5 in his pocket to go to the University of Tennessee, and then 20 years later was elected as mayor. He served 3 years as city law director, 6 years as mayor, and then that was from 1956 till 1965. And if you think back, that was in the times when we had all the battles over immigration. The Black community, the African-American community in Knoxville loved my dad, and he received about 90% of the Black vote in 3 races for mayor, which is almost unheard of for a conservative Republican. So I was very proud of my dad. He was a little different from me. He probably rolled over in his grave when I voted against the war in Iraq. But as you know, I started out as sort of a traditional Republican, but I became a very, very anti-war Republican as the years went by.
So when you were elected, Ronald Reagan was just leaving.
Right, and Ronald Reagan did taped an ad for me, a TV and radio ad, and I always appreciated that. But I really didn't. I just got in on the very last couple of months that he was in office.
Now, were you replacing your father, or was there somebody else who served in between?
I replaced my dad. My dad had cancer and passed away in June, and I was elected in November and was sworn in the day after the election in 1988. And then I stayed, and the 30 years passed by very quickly. As you know, I had a very Ron Paul type voting record. In fact, and the whole time I was there was a vote 400-3 or something like that. It was always me and Dr. Paul, and I had great admiration and respect for him also. And in fact, we met. We had, whenever we were in session, we had our once a week meeting in Ron Paul's office, and it was just me and him and a small handful of others. So the National Journal covered the Congress very closely, and one year they had they came up with all these different caucuses that they thought would describe certain members of Congress, and they put me as one of three in a rabble-rouser caucus. So I was pretty outspoken on a lot of the issues, but of course I never did run for president, so I wasn't nearly as well known as Dr. Paul was.
Now, did you turn maybe 18? Were you about 18 when your father first entered the Congress?
That's correct, Don. He came the year that I turned. He was sworn in January. I turned 18 in July.
Okay.
Of that year.
And were you living at home at that time?
Yes, my dad and mother moved to Washington with my younger brother and younger sister, but I stayed at home because I was starting that fall at the University of Tennessee, and I did my undergraduate work there, and then I went to George Washington to law school, and I did all my law school up there, but I always knew I was coming back to Knoxville to practice law, and that's what I did. I had a fascinating law practice. My very first case was to represent a woman a black woman who had killed her husband. And so very almost unheard of for a young lawyer to have his first case be a first-degree murder case, but that happened to me. So I had a very active law practice. Then I became a criminal court judge and tried the felony criminal cases, including I tried the attempted murder of James Earl Ray. My court was the only court that James Earl Ray ever testified in. So I had a fascinating law practice and judgeship too.
What would be some of the most memorable moments from being a criminal court judge?
Well, certainly the James Earl Ray case was the biggest or the most high profile case, but I also was the only member of Congress that ever sentenced anybody to the electric chair, which I did one time when I was a judge. So, but I can say this: since most criminal court judges come out of a prosecution background, I was one of the rare ones that had come out of a criminal defense background. So, a lot of people wanted in my court, and so. I don't know. It was. It seems like all my life I have kind of rooted for the underdog in sports and in my law practice and in all kinds of things. In fact, I'll tell you this: one time I represented a man on another first-degree murder case, and the courtroom was filled with friends and relatives of the victim. And when the police officer brought my client out of the holding cell, he leaned over and whispered to me, he said, "Boy, it's you against the world, you against the world." And so I had some pretty tough cases, but I also think that toughened me up and gave me the guts to cast some pretty unpopular votes when I was in Congress. But as you said earlier, though, when they found out I was against the war in Iraq, they brought me down and put me in a little secure room at the White House with Condoleezza Rice and George Tenet and John McLaughlin, the director and deputy director of the CIA. And they tried to put a lot of pressure on me about voting for the war. But I told him, I said, well, it seemed to me that if you voted for the war, you were going against every traditional conservative position I've ever known, because it was going to be massive foreign aid, huge deficit spending. It was going to be that we were going to war to support UN resolutions when conservatives had traditionally been the biggest critics of the UN. But the big thing to me, Lawrence Lindsay, the President Bush's economics advisor, a Harvard professor, had said the day before, or maybe 2 days before I was at the White House, that a war with Iraq would cost us $200 billion or more. And I asked about that, and Condoleezza Rice said, oh, no, it wouldn't cost them more than 50 or 60 billion, and we get some of that back from the Allies, which I've always said must have been the worst estimate in the history of the world. But I can tell you, I saw within a fairly short time that all these wars were just about getting more money and power for defense contractors and military leaders, and also were about giving most members of Congress the opportunity to show how tough they were or how patriotic they were. And they were almost never about any real threat to us. So Ron Paul and I voted several times to get out of Afghanistan before we did. And in fact, if the Congress had followed us in that vote, we wouldn't have lost those 13 soldiers who were killed at the end, including a young man from my district.
Hey everybody, Old Woods is always looking to improve your life, and yet another way in which I do that is saving you a bundle on business software. My friends at Federated Computer are changing the way businesses buy software. We all need software to run our businesses, but the best business software doesn't have to cost thousands of dollars each month. The typical Federated Computer customer saves 75% or more on their software bill and gets great software, top-notch customer service and support, and a software solution that is uniquely installed for your business and without any surveillance or breaches of privacy. For example, if you use Google for email, Salesforce for CRM, Slack for team chat, ListMonkey for customer communications, and Airtable for data management, with a team of 10, you'd save $9,000 per year on software costs switching to Federated Computer. And what's wild, the cost of Federated Computer doesn't grow as your team grows. And you can use your Federated Computer savings to grow your business rather than feed the woke Silicon Valley software companies. The Federated Computer team invented computing in the cloud. Now they're taking a hammer to the ridiculously high prices of business software and have many, many satisfied customers to prove they deliver. Federated Computer has been a longtime supporter of the Tom Woods Show, and they're offering 30% off their already low prices when you use coupon code WOODS. Go to www.federated.computer to begin to save 75% or more on your monthly software costs. That's www.federated.computer. These folks are going to do you a big favor. Check them out. Well, you said earlier that you started off more conventional, as a more conventional Republican in terms of foreign policy. Was it Iraq specifically that started to change your mind, or was there something before that?
No, it was before that. I actually voted for the first Gulf War in 1991, but then I started reading various articles. I was speaking to a group at the Greenbrier one time, and I picked up a newspaper, and it told that we were spending $4 million a day to enforce a no-flight zone against Iraq when they had really had no Air Force at all. And then I saw another article in those years where one of our bombs had gone astray and killed 7 little boys who were playing soccer in Iraq, and it told of the terrible anguish of one of the fathers who was holding his son's head, who had been blown off by this bomb. And so those things really got to me, and I started reading all I could about whether we should go to war in Iraq. And I know Fortune magazine had a prolonged war in Iraq would make American soldiers sitting ducks for Islamic terrorists. And there was another article in U.S. News World Report that said, why the rush to war? And we had these chicken hawks like Dick Cheney and Paul Wolfowitz who had never served in the military. And actually, I served in the military. And so I just thought it was the wrong thing to do. And I can tell you that I'm speaking out now that in my columns that I write in other ways about I don't believe we should go to war in Iran. And I hope that the president doesn't let Netanyahu talk into going to war in Iran. I think that would be a big mistake.
Well, all this week on the show, these episodes haven't come out yet, but they're about to. I've been talking about that topic because it's on everybody's minds. And obviously it's on Dr. Paul's mind and everybody at that conference that you and I attended recently. I am curious about, like, apart from foreign policy, just your overall experience as a member of the Republican Party from the late 1980s, as at the beginning of your career as a congressman, down to nearly 2020. How would you describe how it changed, if at all? And did it change in a good or a bad way? And also, did you generally get along with the with the party as a whole?
I got along personally with almost everybody up there. In fact, my friend Thomas Massey used to get a kick out of it. He was so impressed that I would sit on the floor of the House with 3 members of the Appropriations Committee, and then I would sit there and vote with him on the appropriations bills. And so he never could figure that out. And in fact, I remember, the first 6 years I was there, we were in the minority, and then we took control. And so these bills, Tom DeLay came to me on the floor, and he was our whip at that point, and was he was almost more powerful than the speaker, and he didn't like the way that I was voting against some of the spending. And he told me, Jimmy, these are Republican bills now. And I said, yes, Tom, but you're spending more than the Democrats were spending. And the Democrats would have spent even more, I'll say that. But that's actually what I think led to the formation of the Tea Party, because when we had control, we didn't even slow the spending hardly. And in fact, I've told people, I've said the national debt was less than $3 trillion at the time I came to Congress, and I thought that was horrible. And but I can honestly say that if everybody had voted the way I had and the way Dr. Paul had, we wouldn't have any debt. Instead, it's getting around 37 trillion now, which is just a mind-boggling. Nobody can even humanly comprehend a figure like that. And the country would be in much better shape, much stronger shape. The whole country would be stronger if we didn't have all that debt hanging over us. But as David Stockman pointed out at the conference we attended, good gosh, it's going to double probably in the next 10 years if we don't do something about it.
Did your father personally know the U.S. presidents he served under? I mean, he didn't serve, you know what I mean? He served simultaneously with?
The presidents all the presidents that I served with were nice to me. Yeah, even the Democratic ones. But of course, I didn't vote for Bill Clinton. I can tell you a little funny story. One time I had 2 firefighters from Knoxville visiting me, and one man had been the Knox County Democratic chair. And I told him, I said, I'm supposed to go to this luncheon with the President Clinton, at noon in the Rayburn room of the Capitol. And I said, if you meet me back here in an hour, I might be able to introduce you to the president. So I was able to work that out. We were staying there at the door to this room. And when the president, they came there with all the media and the reporters and all that. And then the president came to the door, and I introduced him to these 2 men. And President Clinton was such a schmoozer. He put his arm around me, and he told them, he said, you all take care of this guy down there now. And Bill Warwick, this former Democratic chairman, he said, oh, we do, Mr. President. We think Congressman Duncan is the greatest. And I thought, I wished I had a recording of that, that statement from one of the Democratic chair people. But I always thought I could express my views in not a mean or hateful way. And I think I was able to do that. And I did express my views not only on the floor, but in articles I wrote and speeches I gave all over the country. Ryan Durdusky, who I've never met to this day, but he wrote a really nice article, the last article that was really written about my service in the Congress. And he called the article, it was for the Week magazine, the news magazine, and he wrote and said, said Jimmy Duncan, the hero America ignored. And honestly, while I wasn't as high profile as Dr. Paul, I don't feel like I was, number one, I don't feel like I was a hero, but number two, I didn't feel like I was ignored. But Ryan Durdusky, he wrote this, and I think it's probably how almost all your listeners feel. He said, Duncan belongs to a brand of conservatism that dates back to the Eisenhower era, one that regularly opposed both the military industrial complex and big business. He looked out for the interests of Main Street instead of Wall Street and voted to protect America's liberty and security at home instead of traveling the world in search of monsters to destroy. And I think that those views probably describe most of the listeners to your podcast.
I would think so. Did your father ever envision the possibility that you might follow him in his seat?
Well, I was very close to my dad. I worshipped my dad, actually, and I was my dad, though. Toward the end, he really tried to talk me out of running. He said it just wasn't as nice a place as when he first came, and he knew that. He knew that I'd done real well in my law practice. He also knew that as a judge in Tennessee, I had a much better pension plan than if I had gone to Congress. But I had the politics in my blood too much, and I just so for me to be elected to Congress was a dream come true. I was very happy with that. And the first year that I was in Congress, the roll call newspaper had a roving photographer that would ask kind of off-the-wall questions, and I usually would try to avoid things like that. But this photographer came, and he said, if there was a statue of you in the Capitol, where would it be and what would it say? And I said, well, it would probably be in the basement and would say, lucky to be here. And I felt that way. I've never lost that feeling the whole time that I was there. I felt very lucky to be there. And a lot of good people, most of the people, even the ones I disagreed with, most of them, you hear about the bad ones, you read about the bad ones, but most of them are some of the finest men and women that I've ever known. You know that I said at that conference that Ron Paul was a real hero to me today. I had the privilege to serve most of the years that Ron Paul was there, but then I served 6 years with Thomas Massey, and he's a real hero to me today too.
Hey gang, here's how to never pay for a book again. Think of the hot issues of our day: gender theory, so-called, Ukraine, the Federal Reserve, or guns, or education, including how would a free society provide it? Well, I've got a free ebook on all of them from a dissident perspective. I've also got obliterations of the worldviews of Bernie Sanders and AOC. I've got a pretty darn good book on national divorce and a whole bunch more. I've got over a dozen, and you can pick whichever one you like, or you can have them all. It's up to you. Find them all at tomsfreebooks.com. In fact, the next time you're about to pull out your credit card to buy a book, think to yourself, wait a minute, didn't old Woods try to save me from this fate of endlessly throwing money at books? Head over to tomsfreebooks.com. Let's see, I want to go back a little bit into the past to 1994. 1994, the Republicans had a big off-year election victory, and Newt Gingrich announced that they had big plans. What were your feelings at that time, and do you feel like the Republicans took advantage of that, or do you think they squandered it?
Well, I think we tried. Newt Gingrich became Speaker, and I became Chairman of the Aviation Subcommittee. Something that I enjoyed, and we went from having 400 or 500 votes a year. The first year that Newt Gingrich was Speaker, we had over 1,200 votes in the House. And they said some members end up being divorced because we were in session so much. But I did feel, as I said, though, I did feel that we didn't do nearly enough on the spending. And, I even today, I said, the problem is for so many years, we've just been spending money that we didn't have. And I was in a very small group that there were probably, it wasn't just me and Dr. Paul, there were probably 60 or 70 Republicans who were consistent votes against most of the appropriations bills. But there again, it changed a little. We went along with a little too much after we took control.
Do you have a particular, maybe we can leave foreign policy out of it. Do you have any votes that you think, I wish I could have that one back? I shouldn't have supported that. Or do you look back on your career and say, I have no regrets?
I don't know that I guess anybody would have a few regrets, but I've, it wasn't just on foreign policy. I mean, I was one of 10 who voted against creation of the Homeland Security Department. I was one of 14 who voted against the Head Start program. I was one of 45 who voted against the No Child Left Behind law. I did all it. Later on, after chairing the aviation subcommittee, I chaired the highways and transit subcommittee. I remember one time I held a hearing against red light cameras. I tried in every way possible to pursue a libertarian conservative philosophy on the spending and a lot of other things. I was very outspoken against all these security machines at the airport. I think really it's just a jobs program now. It's I don't think it does much good at all in spite of huge spending. And it wasn't just in the government. I mean, FedEx told me that they, after 1 year after 9/11, that they, as a company, had spent $200 million that year alone just on security matters. So there's a lot of things that I could talk about that were disappointing to me, but I still liked having the pulpit that I had. Writing, I've done a lot of writing over the years. In fact, I still write a weekly column for the Knoxville Focus newspaper. So anybody who gets really bored or has a lot of time, they can read what I've written every week for the last 4.5 years. And sometimes I write things that I try to write not just on the issues, but I wrote one column entitled Elvis and I Sound Great Together. Another column I wrote, I said, I wish I still have my 1967 Mustang. So I try to write some kind of human interest type things as well, but it's Knox Focus, Duncan Archives.
What do you think is, if you were to be in Congress in 2025, how do you think it would be different from the career you had?
The ones
angrier, don't you think?
Yes, it is. I go back a couple times a year. In fact, I've been up there twice. I was up there twice in March, once for the State of the Union speech and once to go to a Southern Republican members' dinner. And so, all the people who were there, I mean, I left a little over 6 years ago, and people tell me it's gotten a lot less friendly, a lot meaner since then. And so that's one difference. But I don't know. I am am pleased at some of the things that President Trump is doing, and I've seen things that I tried to do that, for instance, I had a group one time ask me that if I could pass one law, what would it be? I told them, I said, and I've never been asked that before, but I told them, and this was years ago, I said, I would pass a law that said the government at all levels could not take any more private property, because I didn't think we had done a good enough job educating young people or even older people about how important private property was to our freedom and our prosperity. And so I had amendments that I offered over the years, and one time I put in an amendment to sell off a bunch of surplus federal property, and I'm here. That was several years ago, and I saw the other day we were trying to do that now. That Elon Musk is trying to do some of that, and we need to convince more people that if these things that they're trying to do on waste, fraud, and abuse, if they don't do those things, it's not going to be long when we're not going to be able to pay the Social Security and all these other things that people want with money that will buy anything. People should read Eric Metaxas's book, his biography of Bonhoeffer, and then it's fairly early in that book, and he tells about the horrendous inflation that Germany had in the 1920s, and that was considered to be the most educated country in the world at that time. There were a lot of smart people there. And then I went to a program with the finance minister of Argentina one time in my first term in office, and he told how they had inflation so much in the late 80s that they had to change the prices in the grocery stores every 4 hours. And somehow our people seem to think that we're immune from some of that, but we're really not.
What was the closest you came to being voted out of office? Probably not very.
No, the first election, the Democrats ran what one newspaper and one of the Washington papers said was the most negative in the country that year, and so they really came after me that first time, and I ended up with 56.23% of the vote. I still remember, and after that, the lowest I got in the Republican primary in 2014, even though I had probably the most Tea Party voting record in the entire Congress. I had a young man who ran against me with the Tea Party was upset, or some opposed me. They would come up to me and they'd tell me that they thought I'd done a great job, but they thought I'd been there too long. There were a lot of people who just thought that if you were in there as long as I had been at that time, and I got 60.5% of the vote in that primary, and that was very disappointing to me because I'd always gotten about 87% in the primary, and I generally got around 75 or 78% in the general election in November. But I can tell you one thing, I never took it for granted. I had seen, for instance, I remember Eric Cantor was our majority whip at one point, and the day before his primary in that year, his pollster had told him he was 30 points ahead, and he ended up losing by 10 points to Dave Brandt, a college professor who was supported by the Tea Party. And so
I remember that distinctly.
I've seen a lot of people who were sure winners who went down to defeat.
Well, that's one of the tricky things about being a congressman, a member of the House of Representatives as opposed to a U.S. senator. That the 2-year term means that no sooner are you elected than you have to be in re-election mode.
You have to run all the time. It's every other year. And in fact, my dad told me many years ago that you can do your best campaigning in the off year. and I took that to heart. And I mean, I thought, well, people sort of took it for granted. You showed up right at election time, but if you showed up a year before the election, they seemed to appreciate it a little bit more.
So does a congressman divide his time between Washington and home? How did you divide your time between those two places?
I think the best decision I ever made was when I told my late wife that I wanted our children to be raised in Tennessee. So all four of our children, they visited Washington a lot, but they were at home, and I ended up spending slightly more time at home than in Washington. Although I also at the same time had one of the best attendance records as far as votes went, and I cast almost 19,000 votes in my 30 years in the Congress.
How does a congressman choose the people around him? Like, do you interview people? Does the party recommend people to you and say these people would be a good staff for your office?
I was really lucky on that. I had one of my best friends, Bob Griffiths, was my chief of staff, and I had, I think, probably less turnover than just about anybody on Capitol Hill, and so I had a good staff that stayed with me throughout most of my career, and so I had. It was primarily almost entirely people from East Tennessee, where I'm from. I did have one man from Cleveland, Ohio, who was with me for 23, I think, years, and most of them, though, were people who I'd met locally. Although I will tell you, my late mother moved from Iowa after college, and I always said that I'm glad we let people move in, because I wouldn't have been here myself if my mother hadn't moved to Tennessee when she did. So, but it ended up, by the time I left office, I made a rough estimate that almost half the people that I represented, and I was representing about 750,000. I think almost half of them had moved from someplace else. It's phenomenal. I wrote a book about my career called From Bat Boy to Congressman.
I have it.
And it has sports stories in there. I don't know. I know you were from Massachusetts originally. I don't know if you ever followed the Red Sox.
I did.
I was a bat boy for Johnny Pesky, and he had me right in the dugout at Fenway Park one time when he later but he was the manager for the Knoxville Smokies the first full year that I was bat boy, and so but that book is written entirely by me, no ghostwriter, and about half of it is humorous. I had stories in there about sex on an airplane and desperate housewives, and about the time the Knox County Baptist men
I've got it.
Told us about some of the time that the Knox County Baptist men, some of them stole the toilet paper at the airport. It's all stories that were related to my work in the Congress, and I've gotten a tremendous reaction to that book. And I still tell. I have a lot of stories in there about presidents with whom I served. For instance, I was one of the first members to endorse Donald Trump for president, and I did that because I was in some of the early meetings about Rand Paul running, and I would have preferred that he had run, but he had backed out, and I thought that Donald Trump was the most anti-war one of the ones who were running, and they told me that he wanted to call me the next day after I'd endorsed him at a Republican dinner in my district, and he called me, and he was in such a good mood, and he talked to me for about 20 minutes, and then my late wife, to whom I had a wonderful marriage, but she was mad at me at that point about something, and she wasn't speaking to me. And so I said, Mr. Trump, do you have a moment to say hello to my wife? And my wife said, no. But I handed her the phone anyway. And then I heard her say, I thought he was pulling my leg. And then about 5 minutes later, she came out smiling and in a good mood. And she said, he was so nice. And she said, he told me that your husband sounds just like me. And I told him, I know, great for the country, but hell to live with. And so he Trump got a big kick out of that story. But that's an example of one of the stories that's in my book.
And one other thing, how did it work? Did lobbyists go to the different offices and congressional offices? And if so, how do they conduct themselves?
Well, I always said almost everybody's a lobbyist for something. And, if they care deeply about, you have teachers, doctors, nurses, everybody, they lobby for you. And usually the way the lobbyists do is they get in to see you or come in with constituents. And of course, I always tried to meet with every one of my constituents who came to Washington. And I had a couple of the tour guides and a couple of the Capitol Police who told me they thought I got more visitors than almost any other member. And I think maybe I did, but Knoxville was a pretty easy 8-hour drive, all interstate. And so we had a lot of people who came and families that came. And that was one of the parts of the job that I enjoyed the most.
I was just wondering because, obviously people want to influence the congressman's votes. And I always wondered, I had an idea of it, but exactly what would a lobbyist have to offer you in exchange for your vote? Money? Like re-election money?
Well, almost all of the associations up there, the realtors or whatever, they make contributions. But I can tell you this: I see articles. I've seen articles saying that some members would spend 30% of their time raising money. I thought that was the craziest thing I ever saw. I was lucky though. Never one time did I ever ask anybody for a campaign contribution. Now I raised money by sending out invitations to lunches or things like that, or 3 times I think I had a golf tournament down in my district. So I tried to raise money, but I never personally asked anybody, not one time, for any money the whole time I was there. And I had people who in Washington who told me, they said, Jimmy, you can raise 3 times what you're raising if you would personally call these lobbyists or these associations. But I never did do that. And fortunately, I was able. I ran what I would say were kind of would be considered very low budget campaigns now, and somebody asked me the first time I ran, they said, how much do you think it will cost you to run for Congress? $300,000. And I said, I sure hope not. But I ended up being in a very difficult first campaign, and I ended up spending $405,000. And but I didn't. I had some of the experts from Washington who told me, "Don't worry about going into debt. You can raise money easier in Washington if you have a debt." And I said, "No, I've got a wife and 4 children to support. I'm not going to go into debt." So I finished the first campaign with $16,000, but now 400,000 wouldn't. Now they don't even blink at a campaign for the House where people spend $2 or $3 million. Amazes me. I saw last night in the news where they said $80 million on the race for the state Supreme Court in Wisconsin. Now, I mean, my goodness, it's just astounding, unbelievable.
Yeah, it's almost like you were one of the last remnants of an older America, before it just became this gargantuan, uncontrollable thing that, as you say, you could run for a reasonable amount and you didn't have to be a 24-hour-a-day fundraising machine to make it possible. I don't know how people do it nowadays, other than just being a 24-hour-a-day fundraiser.
I think you may be. I think you may be right. I think I guess I'm kind of from the old school in a lot of ways, and but I went. I did it mostly. I thought being in the House. I was offered one time. Phil Graham, who was the head of the senatorial campaign committee, flew down to Knoxville and offered me $3 million if I would run for the Senate, and told me he'd put me in touch. They'd put me in touch with people who could raise me another $3 million. And at that point, that was January of '95. They thought you could run a pretty good statewide race in Tennessee for $7 or $8 million, and so offering me $6 million up front was an awfully nice offer. But I turned that down because at that point I'd been in the House only for 4 years, and my youngest son was 6 years old, and I thought, well, if I ran, I'd have to take two years away from my family, and I just didn't want to do it, and I never regretted that because I did get to stay 30 years in the House.
Do you have advice for, let's say, a young idealistic person who somehow manages to get elected? Just any words of wisdom based on your experience?
I've been asked that a lot, and there's no certain path. I mean, in the old days, it really helped if you were a lawyer, and I was a lawyer. Now, though, I think there are probably too many lawyers, and that has, and advertising by lawyers is sort of, I think, downgraded the profession. And so now, if you have three people running for Congress and two of them are lawyers, the one who's a non-lawyer will brag about being a non-lawyer, and so being sort of a political plus. So now you can run for Congress better, probably coming from a business background than anything else. But the House is the highest office that you can hold and still do things on a person-to-person basis. And I had a big advantage because of my dad. But what I did for years before I ever ran for Congress, I drove him around or substituted for him. So even though I served 30 years in Congress, I probably worked at it for more than 20 years before I ever got there. And so some people, especially young people, they want to get involved and get elected to Congress right off the bat. And unless they have $5 or $10 million to do that, that's just not possible. You have to just really work at it for years to really get there, in my opinion. And of course, you've got probably several thousand people in any congressional district that would love to serve in Congress and who think that they can do a much better job than the people who are there. My dad told me a long time ago, he said, everything looks easy from a distance. And I think that is so true, and I think it's especially true about sports and politics. But if somebody wants to do it, in fact, I've told people, I've said, you shouldn't run for office unless you want it worse than about anything you've ever wanted in your life. And I said, if you think you can campaign 16 hours a day for a couple of months and you come home and it's a cold, rainy night and you get home at 8 o'clock and it's the earliest you've gotten home for the last couple of months, and you take off your suit and tie and you put on your pajamas early and you sit down to read the paper, and you see that some political person has died, and if you can make yourself get back up, put your suit and tie back on, drive across town and go to the funeral home, when that's the last thing in the world you really would like to do, then you're ready to run for Congress.
I guess that is probably sound advice. The book, as I say, I know I have it, but I am so ashamed to tell you that there is no rhyme or reason to how these books behind me are arranged. I would love to tell you that I have a system. There is no system. The system is I look for a book by scanning all the titles. I know I should do something about that. I know all my OCD listeners are going out of their minds knowing that. But I do know that somewhere on this shelf, I have my copy of From Bat Boy to Congressman, 30 Years in the U.S. House by you, Congressman Duncan. And it is a wonderful read. It does give you the kind of insight you won't get from a typical history book because it's coming from a person who was actually there. And as you say, it's filled with funny stories, interesting anecdotes, and it gives you some of the flavor and texture of your career. So I do recommend it. I'll put the link at tomwoods.com/2628. And unless you have any final words, I appreciate your time. Thank you.
Well, I'll say again, I just have so much admiration for you, and when you said that about your books being messed up, my late wife used to tell me no more books. But if you're a book person, you just really can't stop. And I used to tell her, I said, that those books are what's going to keep me alive to at least 100 because it'll take me that long to read all my books. But I thought also when you said that, my books are all are just like yours. And there was an African-American man who ran the subway in the Rayburn building, very nice man. And no matter what you would say to him, he would smile real big and he'd say, "I know the feeling." And that's what when you told me about your books, I thought of that man, and I know the feeling. But thank you so much for allowing me to be with you, and thank you for putting in that plug about my book. I've had many people tell me it's the easiest read that they ever had because it's just these 203 little vignettes or stories. Some are serious, some are humorous, and all are true. But thank you very much for having me here and thank you for what you do for this country.
That's very kind of you to say, Congressman. Thank you. And I will say the other way in which I hope my books will, keep me alive till I'm 100 is that I think by staying mentally sharp and engaging in intellectual tasks, that will keep the old noodle operating at, an optimal level as opposed to retiring and playing golf all day. So I am trying to do things like that so that I will have, many, many robust years left to me in the future.
Oh, I think you've got a great future ahead.
Well, thank you once again, Congressman, and thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
Make yourself and those you love less vulnerable to the regime, both mentally and physically. Get more forbidden information at tomsfreebooks.com and be sure to subscribe to the show wherever you listen. See you next time.
Like the sound of The Tom Woods Show? My audio production is provided by Podsworth Media. Check them out at podsworth.com.